They settled the debt the way her mother settled everything, quietly, without looking her in the eye. Eva Baldi was not crying when they signed the contract. She had run out of tears somewhere between her mother's third glass of wine and the moment the notary slid the paper across the mahogany desk like it was nothing more than a property transfer. Because that is exactly what it was. She was 22 years old, dressed in the red dress her mother had chosen. Look presentable, Eva, at least give him something to look at, and she stood in the doorway of Federico Coppola's private study while rain hammered the iron gates of his Sicilian estate, wondering if this was the night she ceased to exist. The answer, she would later discover, was yes. But not in the way she feared. The study smelled of old leather, gunpowder, and cold espresso. Federico Coppola did not rise when she entered. He sat behind a desk carved from black walnut, a single lamp carving shadows across the sharp angles of his face. His charcoal suit was immaculate. His dark hair was combed back with the precision of a man who controlled everything within arm's reach, and a great many things far beyond it. He didn't look at her mother. He looked at the contract. 140,000 euros, he said. His voice was low, unhurried. The voice of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. Your signature is already on it. So is mine. That means this conversation is already over. Eva's mother, Giuliana Baldi, who had once told Eva that a woman's greatest asset was her ability to make powerful men comfortable, reached out and touched Eva's cheek. A kiss, brief and dry, pressed to her temple. "Be good," she whispered. And then she was gone. The door clicked shut. And Eva stood alone in a room with the most dangerous man in southern Italy, wearing a red dress that suddenly felt less like clothing and more like a target. Federico finally looked up. His eyes, dark, still, utterly unreadable, moved across her face with the same detached efficiency he had used on the contract. She waited to feel assessed. Catalogued. Reduced. Instead, he said, "You're shaking." "Yes," Eva said. Because she had never learned the art of pretending otherwise. Something shifted in his expression. Barely. A flicker, there and gone, like a candle in a sealed room. He reached into his desk drawer. Eva's breath caught, but what he placed on the desk was not a weapon. It was a key. "Your room is on the second floor," he said. "You will not be touched. You will not be harmed. In this house, you are not a guest and you are not a prisoner." He paused. "What you are remains to be decided." He looked back down at his papers. She had been dismissed. Eva picked up the key with fingers that had finally stopped shaking, not because she was no longer afraid, but because something stranger than fear had taken root in her chest. She had expected a monster. She had found a man who bled. She just didn't know it yet. She would notice the blood later, dried dark on his left knuckle, half hidden by his cufflink, from a fight he had not mentioned and never would. She would offer him her handkerchief. And that small, stubborn act of kindness would be the thing that undid them both. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The estate revealed itself slowly, the way dangerous things often do. The iron gates parted without a sound, oiled, precise, like everything else in Federico Coppola's world, and the car rolled through an avenue of stone pines that stood like sentinels on either side of the gravel path. Eva pressed her fingers against the cold window glass and watched the main house emerge from the darkness ahead. It was enormous. 3 stories of pale Sicilian limestone, draped in old bougainvillea that had long since stopped being tended, its blooms gone to tangle and shadow. Beautiful, she thought. And completely, utterly airless. A man she didn't know carried her single bag inside without a word. The entrance hall was marble and silence, a chandelier overhead that held real candles, half of them burned to stumps. Eva stood in the middle of it and told herself, very quietly, that she was not going to cry. She had already cried in the car. That was enough. Federico appeared from a side corridor, still in the charcoal suit from the study, jacket now removed, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to the forearm. He moved through the space with the ease of a man who had never once questioned his right to occupy it, every room, every silence, every shadow belonging to him by some law older than courtesy. He didn't greet her. He simply looked at her the way you look at something delivered to the wrong address, deciding whether to keep it or send it back. And then Eva saw his hand. Left knuckle. A split in the skin, still fresh enough to glisten, the kind of wound that comes from bone meeting something harder than it should. He hadn't dressed it. Probably hadn't noticed it, or hadn't cared, which she suspected were the same thing for a man like him. She didn't think. That was the honest truth of it. There was no strategy, no calculation. Her hand simply went to her jacket pocket and came out with the folded square of white linen she always carried, the one habit her grandmother had pressed into her before everything else in her life had come apart. She held it out. Federico went very still. Not the stillness of surprise, exactly. More the stillness of a man encountering something he had no existing category for, the way you pause when you hear a language you almost recognize. "Your hand," Eva said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. "It's bleeding." He looked down. Then back at her. Then, with the deliberate slowness of a man making a decision he hadn't planned to make, he took the handkerchief. He didn't thank her. But he didn't look at her like a debt anymore, either. He pressed the linen to his knuckle and walked away, and Eva stood alone in the entrance hall with the chandelier guttering overhead, and thought, I am going to survive this place. She didn't know how yet. But the thought had arrived with a certainty that surprised her, solid and quiet in her chest like the first stone of a foundation. The days that followed were an education in absence. Federico did not speak to her at breakfast, when he appeared at all, which was rarely, and always briefly, coffee in hand, eyes on whatever document had followed him from his study. He did not acknowledge her in the corridors. He moved through the estate like a current of cold water, present and purposeful and utterly unreachable. Eva learned the house the way you learn a language, by listening to what it couldn't say. There were 7 full-time staff, most of them old enough to have served Federico's father, and possibly his father's father. Carmela ran the kitchen, 70 years old and arthritic in both wrists, still insisting on kneading her own bread every morning. Enzo managed the grounds, or had once. His knees had given out 2 summers ago and the east garden had been slowly surrendering to weeds ever since, which pained him visibly every time he passed the window. There was Rosa, who cleaned, Matteo, who drove, and 2 younger men whose primary function appeared to be standing in doorways looking purposeful. None of them had been asked, Eva suspected, how they were doing in quite some time. So she asked. She asked Carmela about her wrists and spent an afternoon in the kitchen learning which tasks she could take over without bruising the old woman's dignity. She sat with Enzo on the low garden wall on the 3rd morning and listened to him describe what the east beds had looked like in his prime. Roses, he said, rose antiche, old varieties you couldn't find in shops anymore, and his voice carried the particular grief of a man mourning something beautiful that had been allowed to die through simple neglect. Show me, Eva said. He looked at her as if she had spoken a foreign language. The roses, she said. Show me where they were. What they need. I have time. She had nothing but time. By the end of the first week, she had cleared 3 meters of the east bed with her bare hands and a pair of gardening gloves she found hanging in the tool shed, stiff with disuse. Enzo directed from the wall, increasingly animated, using his cane to point at root systems she had uncovered, his voice climbing an octave whenever she found something worth saving. She didn't know if Federico noticed. She didn't do it for him to notice. But one evening she came in from the garden, dirt under her fingernails, hair escaping in every direction, and found Carmela had left a cup of hot tea on the kitchen table with a small square of almond cake beside it, and no explanation. Some houses, Eva was beginning to understand, speak in their own dialect. She was learning to listen. She found the library by accident on a Tuesday. She had been looking for the linen cupboard. Carmela had asked her to fetch an extra tablecloth, and had opened the wrong door at the end of the east corridor, and stepped into a room that stopped her breath. Floor to ceiling, every wall. Books in Italian, in French, in English, in what she thought might be Latin. Old ones, spines faded to amber and cream, and newer ones too, some still with their receipts tucked inside the front cover like Federico had bought them and never quite found the moment. A reading chair sat angled toward the tall window, and the afternoon light came through the glass in long amber columns that made the room feel less like a library and more like the inside of something alive. Eva forgot about the tablecloth entirely. She ran her fingers along the spines until one snagged her attention, Pavis, the moon and the bonfires, and she pulled it free, sat in the reading chair, and opened to the first page. She didn't hear him come in. That edition belonged to my mother. Eva was on her feet before she had fully processed the words, the book clutched to her chest, fully prepared to apologize her way backwards out of the room and never return. Federico stood in the doorway, jacket off again, that same rolled-sleeve posture that seemed to be the only version of him that was remotely approachable, watching her with an expression she was learning to read, the one that was not quite cold but had forgotten how to be warm. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I didn't know this room was. I'll put it back." "Did you damage it?" "No." "Then sit down." She sat today, mostly out of shock. He crossed to the shelves on the opposite wall, pulled a different volume without looking, and settled into the chair behind the reading desk as though this had always been the arrangement, as though she had always been there, and the past 10 days of careful mutual silence had simply been a postponement of the inevitable. They read in quiet for a long time. Then, "Do you actually understand Pavis, or did you choose it because the spine looked important?" Eva considered lying. "Then didn't. I chose it because I've read it before," she said. "My professor at university said it was sentimental. I thought he was wrong." A pause. Something that was almost a shift at the corner of Federico's mouth. "You studied literature?" "For 2 years. Then my mother needed," she stopped. "Then I stopped." He didn't pursue it. But he also didn't look back at his book immediately. He studied her the way he had studied the contract in the study, with the same careful, unreadable attention, except that this time, she had the unsettling impression that the assessment was coming out differently than he had expected. "You are not what I thought you would be," he said finally. Eva met his eyes. "What did you think I would be?" "Decorative," he said. "Quiet. Afraid." "I am afraid," she said honestly. "I know," he said. "But you came into my library anyway." He looked back at his book. Eva looked back at hers. The amber light moved across the floor between them, and something unnamed settled into the room like a third presence, not warmth, not yet, but the faint structural possibility of it. The way you can feel, before a fire is lit, that the wood is dry enough to catch. He came back at 2 in the morning. Eva heard the car first, the crunch of gravel, too fast, then the front door, and then a silence that had a different texture than the usual silence of the house. Heavier. Wrong. She was in the corridor before she had consciously decided to be, and she found him in the entrance hall, the same marble and candlelight as the night she arrived, except now there was blood. A real wound this time, not a split knuckle. His side, she could tell from the way he was holding himself, one hand pressed beneath his jacket, his breath controlled in the way that cost something. He looked up and saw her and said, with the magnificent stubbornness of a man raised to show nothing, "Go back to bed." "Sit down," Eva said. He actually looked surprised. Which, she was finding, was becoming one of her favorite things to produce in him. "Eva." "Federico." She said his name for the first time, and it landed in the room with unexpected weight, and they both felt it. "Sit Down. He's Saturday. She got the first aid kit from the kitchen. She had found it 2 weeks ago and reorganized it, because it had been a catastrophe of expired antiseptic and unrolled bandages, and she had fixed it the way she fixed everything in this house, quietly, without announcement, because it needed doing. She came back to find him exactly where she had left him, jacket removed, the wound exposed, a cut, long and clean, probably a blade, deep enough to need pressure but not deep enough to kill him. Tonight. She worked without speaking. Cleaned it. Butterflied it closed. Wrapped it with the careful economy of someone who had, in a different life, spent a great deal of time tending to things that had been damaged through no fault of their own. His breathing had steadied. The controlled, costed kind had relaxed into something easier. She could feel him watching her while she worked, not the assessment from the library, not the cataloging from the first night. Something quieter than either of those. "You're not afraid of blood," he said. "I grew up poor," she said. "You learn." Most people would have stayed in their room. Eva tied off the bandage and sat back and looked at him directly, the way she had decided, somewhere in the last 2 weeks, she was going to keep doing no matter how uncomfortable it made either of them. "You're hurt," she said simply. "I was awake. There wasn't really a choice." Federico looked at her for a long moment. "There is always a choice," he said. "Most people simply choose themselves." "Then most people are missing the point," Eva said. She stood, gathered the used materials, and was almost at the door when he spoke again, quietly, in a voice that sounded like it came from somewhere he didn't usually allow visitors. "Thank you." Eva paused. Didn't turn around. Gave him the privacy of not being watched when he was being soft. "Good night, Federico," she said, and went back upstairs. She lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and understood, with a clarity that frightened her slightly, that she was beginning to care what happened to him. Not because she had been told to. Not because the contract required it. But because he was a man who had been taught that tenderness was a liability, and she had grown up in a house where love was transactional, and somehow between the library and the bandages they had recognized each other across a distance that should have been unbridgeable. She told herself it was dangerous. She was right. She didn't stop. Eva Baldi arrived on a Thursday, unannounced, in a car Eva didn't recognize. She swept into the entrance hall wearing a silk blouse and the particular smile she reserved for situations where she needed something wide, warm, completely architectural, built from the outside in. She pulled Eva into an embrace that smelled of her perfume and held none of her presence. "My darling," she said. "Look at you. You look well. The country air agrees with you." Eva stood in her mother's arms and felt, for the first time with real clarity, the shape of what had always been missing there. Not absence, exactly. More like the deliberate arrangement of Womp's furniture in a room with no heat source. Federico was not on the estate. She knew his schedule the way you come to know the rhythms of a place you are paying attention to. He would be gone until evening. Her mother knew this too. "Walk with me," Juliana said, taking Eva's arm. "I've missed you terribly." They walked the garden, the east beds, where 3 weeks of Eva's labor had coaxed the first green shoots back through the dark soil. Her mother didn't notice them. Her mother's eyes were moving across the estate with the patient, methodical interest of someone taking inventory. "He trusts you," Juliana said. It wasn't a question. "He tolerates me," Eva said carefully. "Don't be modest. Carmela told one of the gate staff that has been seen in the library with you. That he came home injured last week and you were the one who," she waved a hand. "The point is, you have access." Eva felt something cold move through her. "Access," she repeated. "His study, Eva. The safe behind the Modigliani print, everyone in certain circles knows it exists. The combination is the only thing," her mother squeezed her arm, intimate and urgent. "You would be set. We would be set. A fresh start, somewhere no one knows either of us." Eva stopped walking. She looked at her mother, really looked, the way she had been avoiding for 22 years, the way you avoid looking directly at the source of a light that hurts. She saw the silk blouse bought on credit. She saw the smile that had never once reached the eyes. She saw the woman who had dressed her daughter in red and delivered her to a dangerous man's doorstep and kissed her temple and said be good and had not looked back once. She thought about Federico pressing her handkerchief to his knuckle. Federico in the library, saying you are not what I thought you would be. Federico, at 2 in the morning, saying thank you in a voice that came from somewhere he kept locked. No, Eva said. Her mother blinked. Eva. No. You don't understand what he is. What that family is. You owe me nothing? I raised you. You sold me, Eva said. Her voice didn't shake. She was faintly amazed by this. You dressed me up and drove me here and signed your name on a contract and you left. And the worst part, she felt something crack open in her chest, something she had been carefully keeping sealed since she was old enough to understand that her mother's love had always come with a bill attached. The worst part is that I spent 22 years trying to earn something you were never going to give me. Juliana's expression shifted. The architectural warmth dropped away and beneath it was something smaller and harder and cornered. You're being dramatic, she said. You should leave, Eva said. Before he gets back. Eva, if you won't do this for me, you are on your own. Completely. Do you understand that? Eva looked at her mother for a long, quiet moment. Yes, she said. I think I finally do. She walked back to the house alone. Behind her she heard her mother's heels on the gravel, retreating, and then the car door, and then the iron gates opening and closing with their customary, oiled precision. The east garden was very still. In the nearest bed, where 3 weeks of her work had gone into the dark soil, a single shoot had pushed through and unfurled into something that was almost, not yet, but almost, a leaf. Eva crouched down and looked at it for a long time. Then she went inside to start dinner, because Carmela's wrists were bad today and someone needed to. She found the envelope on her bed the following morning. No note. Just a small brass key on a worn leather fob, the kind that opened the main gate. She recognized it immediately, and beneath it, a cloth bag that clinked when she lifted it. She loosened the drawstring and looked inside at more money than she had held in her entire life. Bundled, neat, enough to start over somewhere entirely new. Eva sat on the edge of the bed for a long time. She understood what this was. Federico Coppola had not survived this long by being careless with information, which meant he knew about her mother's visit. He knew what had been asked of her. And this, the key, the money, the open door, was not a gift. It was a question. The most honest kind, the kind that requires no words and accepts no performance as an answer. Will you leave? She turned the key over in her palm. Thought about the road beyond the iron gates, the stone pines, the world that existed outside this limestone estate with its half-burned chandelier and its recovering rose beds and its silences that were slowly, incrementally, learning to hold something other than cold. Then she thought about Federico. Not the version of him that the world knew, the charcoal suit and the silenced gun and the name that made men lower their voices in certain rooms. She thought about the version she had been quietly assembling over the past weeks from the evidence he couldn't help leaving behind. The books in the library with their receipts still inside, unbothered, as if he kept meaning to read them and kept being called away. The way he took his coffee standing up, always facing the window, as though sitting down for it might constitute a kind of surrender. The photograph on the reading desk she had never asked about, a woman with dark hair and Federico's jaw, standing in a garden that had once, clearly, been the garden outside his mother. The roses. The library with her books still on the shelves. Federico Coppola was not a free man. He had inherited a kingdom made of obligation and blood, and he wore it the way you wear something that has grown into your skin, not because you chose it, but because removal would cost more than endurance. She put the key and the money back in the envelope. She went downstairs, set it on his desk without knocking. He wasn't in the study, she could tell by the quality of the quiet, and went to the kitchen to help Carmela with breakfast. When Federico came down an hour later, she was at the kitchen table peeling oranges, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said a word about the envelope or the key or the money. But something shifted in his face. Something below the surface, tectonic, the kind of movement that doesn't announce itself and changes everything anyway. He sat down at the kitchen table, something she had never seen him do, and Carmela, without a word, set a cup of coffee in front of him. He took it sitting down. His name was Dante Ricci. Second in command for 11 years, which in the Coppola organization was long enough to know where everybody was buried, sometimes literally. He was broad-shouldered and silver-templed and possessed of the particular patience of a man who had been waiting for his moment with the discipline of someone who genuinely believes it will arrive. Eva had met him twice. Both times he had been courteous in a way that had no warmth in it whatsoever, his eyes moving over her with an assessment entirely unlike Federico's, calculating in a different register, the way you calculate a variable rather than a person. She didn't like him. She didn't say so, because nobody had asked. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Dante had been watching Federico the way predators watch prey that is beginning to slow. He had noticed the kitchen breakfasts. Had heard, through Matteo, that Federico had been seen in the library 2 evenings in a row. Had registered the way his employer's attention had acquired, in recent weeks, a quality of distraction it had never carried before. Softness, in their world, was not an evolution. It was a liability. What Eva also didn't know was that 3 days after her mother's car had rolled back through the iron gates, a meeting had taken place. A restaurant in Palermo, a corner table, 2 people who had never previously had cause to sit across from one another, Dante Ricci, who wanted Federico's position, and Eva Baldi, who wanted Federico's safe. They had ordered wine and reached an understanding. The annual Coppola masquerade, a tradition Federico continued out of the same stubborn loyalty to form that made him keep his mother's books on the shelves, was 3 weeks away. Every significant figure in the Southern organization would be present. It was, Dante had always thought, a structural vulnerability dressed in candlelight and black tie. He had simply needed the right moment and the right accomplice. Now he had both. The estate transformed itself for the occasion. Caterers arrived Thursday. Florists Friday. By Saturday evening the entrance hall that Eva had first stood in, frightened and red-dressed and determined not to cry, was unrecognizable, banked in white flowers and lit by 100 real candles, the chandelier finally fully stocked and blazing. The guests arrived in a procession of dark cars and darker suits, the women beside them adorned and watchful, everyone wearing masks that covered the eyes and changed nothing underneath. Eva wore midnight blue. Federico had left it on her bed the previous morning without comment, and it fit perfectly, which told her he had paid attention to something she had never asked him to notice. She put it on and stood in front of the mirror and tried to remember the last time someone had done something for her without expecting to be repaid. She was still trying to remember when she went downstairs. Federico met her at the bottom of the staircase. Black tie, charcoal, always charcoal, mask held loosely in one hand, and he looked at her the way he had been increasingly looking at her in recent weeks, like a man recalculating a distance he had thought was fixed. "You look," he stopped. Started again. "Blue suits you." From Federico Coppola, this was practically a sonnet. Eva felt warmth move through her chest and kept her face composed and said, "Thank you for the dress," and watched the acknowledgement pass through his eyes like light through water. The party was 3 hours of orchestrated elegance, music, movement, the careful geometry of powerful people navigating each other. Eva stayed close enough to Federico to be present and far enough to give him room, and she watched the room the way she had learned to watch every room she had ever needed to survive, for the thing that was wrong. She found it in the champagne. She saw Dante near the drinks table at the 2-hour mark, his back to the room, a moment of deliberate positioning that lasted just slightly too long. A server moved away. Dante moved away. The glass remained. Eva had been watching people her whole life. She knew the difference between a man doing nothing and a man doing something that looked like nothing. She was halfway across the room when Federico reached for the glass. She got there first. She lifted it, turned, and set it on a passing tray with a gesture so smooth and social it might have been entirely incidental. "You have the Maltese consul waiting, he's been trying to catch your eye for 20 minutes. And Federico turned to find the consul, and Eva stood where she was and breathed and kept her face perfectly, completely still. She had bought perhaps 20 minutes before Dante realized the glass had been redirected. Perhaps less. Across the room she saw her mother, and understood the full architecture of the evening in one cold, complete flash. Juliana standing close to Dante's 2 lieutenants, her smile doing the work her hands couldn't. The exits were being watched. The loyal guards had been redirected to the perimeter on a pretense she could construct without difficulty. Federico was going to be alone within the hour. Eva set down her own untouched champagne and went to find Matteo. She found him outside the east corridor, at his post. "I need you to listen to me," she said. "And I need you to decide in the next 30 seconds whether you trust me." Matteo, 50 years old, 22 of them in Federico's service, a man who had, Eva had noticed, always been the one to make sure Federico ate something when he worked through dinner, looked at her for exactly the 30 seconds she had requested. "Tell me," he said. She told him. Quickly, clearly, without drama. Dante. The champagne. Her mother. The lieutenants watching the exits. The timeline she estimated. Matteo's face underwent a series of small, rapid adjustments that resolved into absolute stillness. "Stay here," he said. "No," Eva said. He looked at her. Dante's going to realize the glass didn't reach him. When he does, he'll move early and he'll use whatever else he has. Federico needs to know now, and you need to get to the 3 guards on the east perimeter and bring them inside before anyone can redirect them again. She held his gaze. "You can't do both. I can do one of them." Another pause. "Shorter this time." "Straight to him," Matteo said. "Don't stop for anyone." She didn't. She moved through the party the way she had learned to move through difficult spaces, not hurrying, because hurrying draws attention, but with the particular purposefulness that makes people assume you are exactly where you're supposed to be. She found Federico with the consul, nodded once at the consul with an apologetic smile, and touched Federico's arm. "I need a moment," she said. "Now, please." Something in her face communicated what her voice carefully wasn't. Federico excused himself in 20 words and they stepped through the door into the corridor, and Eva told him everything, the same way she had told Matteo, quickly, clearly, without softening it. Federico went very still in the way she now knew meant he was at his most dangerous. "Dante," he said. Just the name. Flat and final, like a door closing. "And my mother," Eva said. "I'm sorry." He looked at her. "Why are you apologizing?" She made her choice," Federico said. "As you made yours." He moved. What happened in the next 40 minutes was something Eva experienced in fragments, raised voices from the main hall, Federico's loyal men materializing from the east corridor where Matteo had retrieved them, the particular silence that falls over a room when power reasserts itself and everyone present recalibrates their understanding of the evening. She stayed in the corridor and she did not go in, because her part was done and she knew the difference between courage and recklessness. She heard Dante's voice at one point, raised and then cut off. She did not hear her mother's voice at all. When Federico came back, he was alone. His mask was gone. His expression was the closed, angular thing it had been on the first night, but underneath it, she could see it now, she had learned to see it, was something exhausted and something else. Something that had been carried a very long way. "It's done," he said. "My mother. Gone. Escorted out. She will be given enough to live on somewhere far from here. A pause. She will not be harmed." Eva let out a breath. "You didn't have to, you stayed," Federico said. "When I gave you the key and the money and the open gate, you stayed. That required something from me in return." He held her gaze. "It required me to be the kind of man worth staying for." The corridor was very quiet. Somewhere behind the closed doors the party was dissolving, guests departing with the polished haste of people who understood that the evening had concluded something larger than itself. Eva stood in the candlelit corridor in her midnight blue dress and looked at the most complicated man she had ever met, and thought, there it is. The thing she had been sensing the shape of for weeks, through libraries and bandages and untouched champagne glasses. The thing that had been building in the dry wood of this house since the night she held out a white handkerchief to a man who had never expected to be offered anything without a price attached. "You are," she said quietly. "For what it's worth." Federico looked at her for a long moment. Then, "Come. We should get you away from this corridor." He offered his arm. She took it. They walked. 3 days later, he came to find her in the garden. She was on her knees in the east bed, which had now produced 6 confirmed shoots and what Enzo had cautiously identified as the beginnings of a Rosa centifolia, old, rare, and apparently more resilient than anyone had given it credit for. She was wearing garden gloves and had dirt on her forearm, and she looked up when she heard his footsteps on the path. Federico stood at the edge of the bed in the morning light, and he was not wearing the charcoal suit. Dark trousers, shirt open at the collar, sleeves already rolled, the approachable version, the one she had come to associate with the moments when he was actually present rather than performing presence. He was holding a document. He crouched down and held it out to her. She pulled off one glove and took it, and read it again. It was the contract. The one with both their signatures, her mother's debt, her life as settlement, the transaction that had brought her through those iron gates in a red dress with no bag worth speaking of and no expectation of surviving the year intact. Across the front, in Federico's handwriting, in the dark ink he used for everything that mattered, paid in full, and below that, a single line she read 3 times before she looked up: stay. Not as a debt. As a choice. Eva sat back on her heels in the garden dirt and looked at the man who had taken everything her mother had built and dismantled it in 4 words, and felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of, something uncomplicated and structural and real, like the first solid stone of a house being laid on ground that had finally been cleared. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," Federico said. "And I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I have the key. I have the money. You made sure of that." "I know," he said again, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it had been occasionally doing for weeks, the thing that was almost a smile, that she suspected had once come more easily and been gradually buried under years of necessary hardness. "Then yes," Eva said. Federico looked at her. "Yes. I'll stay." He nodded once, the way he agreed to things that mattered, simply, without performance. Then he looked at the garden bed, at the shoots Enzo had been monitoring with the anxious pride of a man watching a miracle he had stopped believing in, and something moved through his expression that Eva recognized because she had felt it herself, standing in this same soil 3 weeks ago. The specific quiet of something returning to life. "My mother planted these," he said. "I know," Eva said. "Enzo told me." He was quiet for a moment. "She would have liked you." Eva looked down at the small green shoots pushing through the dark earth, fragile and determined and entirely uninterested in the odds against them. "Tell me about her," she said. Federico Coppola, the most feared man in southern Italy, a man who had been taught that tenderness was a liability and had believed it until a girl in a red dress had shown up in his entrance hall and offered him a handkerchief, sat down on the garden wall beside where she was kneeling in the dirt, and in the morning light filtering through the stone pines, he began to talk. Eva listened. The iron gates stood open at the end of the drive, not because anyone had forgotten to close them, but because Federico had given the instruction that morning, quietly, to Matteo, who had understood without needing it explained. For the first time in a long time, the Coppola estate breathed, and that is where Eva Baldi finally found what she had been looking for her entire life, not a rescue, not a transaction, but a home built on something her mother had never taught her was possible: the truth. If this story moved you, if you felt Eva's quiet courage, or found yourself hoping Federico would finally let himself breathe, then you already know this is more than just a story. It's about every person who has ever given their best to someone who didn't deserve it, and had the strength to finally choose differently. Subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what comes next, because Eva and Federico's story is only just beginning, and I promise you, the chapters ahead will break you open in the best possible way. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. I genuinely want to say hello to every single one of you, because knowing how far this story has traveled means everything to me. See you in the next one.